Now, thank you all for coming to the Edvent. Some of you, from long ago and far away, but some of you in cyberspace. But thank you all for coming. Ed, as you know, is and has been a treasure to us to the philosophy department for 46 years. And when you pick up, the facts you can pick up about him from the CV is impressive enough. BA from Yale, 61, PhD Northwestern, 67, visiting professor at half a dozen universities, Yale, New School, Rutgers, Amherst, Emory, Williams, APA president, a few books, 10 in fact. As appropriate for a phenomenologist, each is gerundic, either explicitly or implicitly. Imagining, remembering, placing, mapping, glancing, edging. So it's phenomenological, literally from the title. Since he's been at Stony Brook, he's directed 75 dissertations, which is a mark that surely will never be surpassed either here or any other university. In fact, his CV is unique in the sense that it surely doesn't cover everything that he's done. I've seen some professors pad their CVs. They go out in the hall and talk to students, and it goes down on their CV. Which deans notice. But Ed, Ed is different. He forgets. I'll look at his addendum and say, Ed, didn't you do this? And he'll say, oh yeah, I wrote that terrific path-breaking book that won this prestigious award. I just forgot to put it down. So he co-founded the Philosophy of the Arts MA program, 20 years ago, is that it?
Yeah.
20-some. But that's just the data. Those are the facts that you can pick up from the CV. And that doesn't even begin to reveal what he means to us. From the outside, he's been the Stony Brook Philosophy Department's great attractor. He's the one who prospective grad students write that they most want to see when they visit Stony Brook from around the world. He's the one whom prospective MA students most want to see when they come to the MA program from across the country. And he's the one that we department faculty members most want to see, even though our offices are on the same floor as his is, because he's so notoriously hard to pin down. I mean, when I was grad director, Ed was chair. I couldn't see him during the day, of course, because he was asleep. I couldn't see him when he came in at 3 or 4, because then he had to talk to people who would be leaving at the end of the workday. And then there were students, and then there was his lunch, and then he'd speak to more students. And so, I'd finally get to talk to him about 11 or 12 or so, and I'd go home, and I'd sneak in the door, I'd take off my shoes, try to slip into the bedroom, and Stephanie would go bolt upright and say, where have you been? Don't lie to me. I know where you've been. You've been in a chair's office, haven't you? So, when and the GPC found it difficult to deal with Ed as chair sometimes because it was impossible to enforce policies. It insisted each grad student was a special case, and he would overrule any attempt we made to stick to the benchmarks of the program, the interface paper, the history paper. And we came up with an acronym to describe that plight, that a grad student was an ESC, an Ed special case. So the department, each grad student class was full of ESCs, Ed special case. So while externally Ed has been the great attractor, internally too, he's helped us all when we needed it. When grad students lost their footing, or ran out of inspiration, or had projects that nobody else wanted to support or needed help, he was there for them. For faculty too, he's helped us all. And he's been there for us when we most needed it. On a personal note, Ed has been there for me at times when I didn't even know there was a there, that somebody had to be there for me for. This room is full of people for whom Ed has been there, which is why we are all here. Here's one more thing about Ed. In many departments, people can be divided into what fiefdom they belong, or what people whose orbit they are in. You can say of someone, for instance, like, oh, he's one of Professor X's people, or he's one of Y's people. But that's not so with Ed. In his eyes, there are no fiefdoms, and he has never been interested in trying to create one. We are all his people. So, this is what we are celebrating today. Ed, we are here because you have been there for us. We're here because you have made us all your people. Ed, this time you are the special case. This first panel is called On Edge, but Tony, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things for the Edvent, the Advent of appropriation, or some of us want to say the Edvent, the Ed-Ignis. So there is a tradition among the Jewish sages, and they describe certain kinds of people who are good people, who are righteous, and they compare them on the one hand to a cedar, and the cedar grows tall and doesn't have any fruit. And then there's another kind of tree that is the date palm, which bears a lot of fruit. And they compare these two kinds of people, the scholar, who produces lots of books and doesn't really communicate with students. And then there's the date palm, who doesn't publish a lot, but has a lot of fruit in terms of the students. But Ed, they don't have a tree named for Ed, because Ed does both, and he's one of the few people who is prolific, scholarly and prolific in terms of his students. Now, it took some work, communal effort, but if you'll cast your glance over here, these are the number of these are the people and the dissertations that Ed has directed, and the committee member that he's been on at Stony Brook alone. Just Stony Brook. This is not counting the external readers, the previous ones. Ed, if you cast a glance over there, you'll see that under director, there's 75. And we have your current ones there too, so it continues. And then on the right-hand side are the committee member people with the dates of their dissertation. That's why I said earlier, we check exactly when, well, I don't know, well, he's not on there. Okay, when all this began in here, and so I think the first one is what, Jen? 1980, it looks like. 80, yeah. And then on the committee, 1978. So Ed, there's the continuing ongoing fruitfulness of both your scholarship and your students. Thank you very much. He's going to say a few words, 3 words after each one, and then maybe jump after.
Okay, good. So I'm just here to Master of Ceremonies. I'm Tom Brockelman. I'm on that list. Began in the mid-80s through, well, it was a long time, probably through the early 90s, I think, by the time I finished. And I'm very much honored to be here and to be part of this event. So thanks to Tony and to Ed for including me. And it's exciting to have this first panel that is at least centered around the world on edge. I think it was 2017, that book, the 2017 Perry phenomenological account of edges and edge phenomena. I think we have 3 speakers here. Is that correct? As it works out?
And then Brian.
Oh, Brian is there. Okay.
Brian's going to
Brian, sorry, didn't mean to minimize you, but and in fact, I think we can have Brian go first. So Brian, if you don't mind, I didn't realize you were there. Hi, Brian.
Hello, Tom. That's good to see you. Before I begin, can I ask someone there to adjust the computer screen so that I only see like at the top corner of your head.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
how about you wanna see Ed here and so on?
I'll see people as they talk. Oh, wonderful, good to
Does
see
that
you.
look good there? Okay.
Okay, so, should I just begin? Okay, good. Well, so sorry that I can't be, well, I was so looking forward to this celebration of Ed's remarkable career, but at least modern technology gives us this opportunity to connect. The paper I'm going to give right now is just a portion of a much longer paper, and I hope this truncated version coheres. It's titled Bioregionalism, Glaciality, and Territorialism. Re-inhabiting and dwelling within a place requires moving beyond certain outmoded modern conceptions of reality and educating, or rather re-educating, ourselves in terms of both a very old yet quite new spatial and temporal orientation, namely bioregionalism. This necessitates a new ground, a paradigmatic shift in our thinking itself. Ed Casey continual engagement with the thought of Deleuze and Guattari brings us to the edge of such a mental ecological shift. In his preface to Getting Back into Place, Ed writes, "To be in the world, to be situated at all, is to be in place. Place is the phenomenal particularization of being in the world, a phrase that in Heidegger's hands retains a certain formality and abstractness, which only the concreteness of being in place, that is, being in the in-place world itself, can mitigate." Can we discover and redescribe that concreteness? Can we regain and restore a sense of the full significance of place? Unquote. Dwelling in place is more than being physically in a place. It's also a state of mind. The concept of place links space and nature to bioregionalism, specifically the space that is the elemental, which is the concretion of the between or the interstitial. My focus here is on bioregionalism, not so much as a social political theory, but rather as an ontology that supports the development of a mental ecology or mental ecosophy, to borrow Guattari's terms. How can bioregionalism be implemented on a concrete level short of a political revolution brought about by cataclysmic environmental change? By changing the way we think about our relation to nature and to each other. Although a relatively new term, bioregionalism is actually a very old way of thinking and existing with nature. It's the way people all over the world have tended over the ages to integrate and organize socially, culturally, and economically with the natural world in which they live. That borders and boundaries were defined by the natural contours of the landscape, by types of vegetation and climatic consistency. Literally meaning life place or life territory. Bioregionalism espouses reorganizing human population, commerce, and natural resources along naturally definable geographic lines, rather than by the artificial boundaries of present geopolitical and cognitive territorialization. Defining bioregionalism as, quote, the entry of place into the dialectic of history, unquote, Gary Snyder, on whose thinking Casey's draws, laments the growing lack of the sense of living in a place, especially in contemporary American society, which is still for many the so-called New World. He notes that, I'll skip that part. Dwelling in a place is not merely living in a particular location. Quote, "A place on earth is a mosaic within larger mosaics," writes Snyder. "The land is all small places, all precise tiny realms replicating larger and smaller patterns. Bioregionalism is a living alongside and within the land, in other words, reorienting one's ways and rhythms according to those of the region in which one dwells." Snyder's figure of your mosaic is not a static image, like a drawing on a map, but rather is a dynamic and fluid movement of territorialization, as expressed in this remarkably resonant way by Deleuze and Guattari. Quote, nomadic waves or flows of deterritorialization go from the central layer to the periphery, and then from the new center to the periphery, falling back to the old center and launching forth into the new. The terms territory, region, and place are not synonyms, though they are intertwined and co-evolving in meaning. In The World on Edge, Casey writes, quote, when places are concatenated into regions, they participate in it. Indeed, they help us to create a smooth space, in Deleuze and Guattari's terms, that is the basis of every enlivened place world, unquote. The relation between these terms is crucial for understanding the way that nomadic dwelling negotiates smooth space, which I will take up a little later. Casey makes several relevant points in the introduction to the second edition of Getting Back into Place that, besides clarifying the relation among the above-mentioned terms, also serve to situate his later considerations of place and region. So now I'm going to read you four separate passages from Ed's work. The first, territory and place. These notions are intertwined, even if their relationship is not symmetrical. Every territory is a place of some kind, but not every place counts as a territory. The latter requires, minimally but essentially, a more or less distinct border. That is, a defining limit that is geographically specific. Territories, then, are distinguished from place and regions by the fact that they are never given up or found, but rather made up. The second passage. Let us agree that a region is minimally a coherent collocation of places, where the places are not necessarily the same in extent, composition, or overall character. Every region is characterized by a characteristic edge, a boundary that is highly permeable. This is what distinguishes a region from a territory, whose perimeter is more or less impervious, or at least clearly marked, order. Regions, especially bioregions, are subject to penetration by many species of animals and plants, and all too often by enterprising human beings. The next section. Thanks to its material essence, a region possesses a certain generality, a lasting, even if not permanent, sameness of aspect and constitution that obtains for all the places contained within it. They are unmistakably the places of that region. This suggests that place and region are coeval and co-requisite. Place and region are, in effect, two poles being located anywhere on Earth, poles that reach out to embrace each other. In the last passage, much shorter, territory and regions, as well as the place itself, are at once natural and cultural. All three manifest both of these parameters and are fully activated and co-embodied through their presence. The takeaways from these passages are: 1, territory and place are non-symmetrically intertwined. 2, a region is a coherent collocation of places, which is what distinguishes a region from a territory. 3, place and region are coeval and co-requisite. And 4, territory, regions, and place are at once natural and cultural. Bioregionalism is a territorially based perspective with a specific agenda to displace, destratify, and decentralize capitalist hegemony, which dictates and maintains current boundaries of territorialization. As we know, Deleuze and Guattari attempt to formulate a positive politics of creativity based upon a principle of accelerated deterritorialization. The term deterritorialization refers in general to any process that disrupts a given relational context, rendering that context abstract and hence unreal, while simultaneously setting the stage for other possible configurations. For example, the colonial imperialist practice of eradicating a conquered people's symbols, beliefs, and rituals and replacing, that is, re-territorializing them with their own as a means of subjugation. Although they most often apply the terminology of territorialization to political and psychological scenarios, Deleuze and Guattari also provide a more environmentally oriented description of deterritorialization, a description that throws into abeyance the possibility of an unknowable archaic. They write, quote, movements of deterritorialization are inseparable from territories that open onto an elsewhere. And the process of re-territorialization is inseparable from the earth, which restores territories. Territory and the earth are two components with two zones of indiscernibility. Deterritorialization, that is from territory to the earth, and re-territorialization, that is from earth to territory. We cannot say which comes first. Unquote. Intertwined with the elemental, that is what is primordial, territory is not the species, or it does not refer to the species, human or otherwise. Territory is the neta, the source of all assemblages and species, organic and organic. Ontologically mappable, territorialization is nevertheless metaphysically anarchic, in the sense of being a process whose origin is epistemologically irreparable. Correspondingly, bioregionalism proceeds from the presupposition that the natural world is also anarchic. That is, prior to the imposition of signifying regimes of sides. And this is, of course, what leaves the bioregional proposal often subject to the criticism that it's nothing more than a simplistic version of social anarchy or chaos. Some naive getting back to nature thinking that binds itself to actual social, economic, and political realities. I'm going to skip over a section here on smooth and striated space. Ed has a lot to say about that in his work. And just finish this short section of this paragraph. In short, the ancient fundamental aim of bioregionalism is to return to the earth with the wisdom of simplicity of lifestyle and recognition of the fact that difference and alterity must be promoted if they're to be maintained. The earth is the primal multiple that must be allowed to continue to generate itself as multiple. The earth's radical is chaotic, rhizomatic. It's not arboreal. In realizing this, bioregionalism is indeed a chaosmosis, to use Guattari's term. This next section I'm titling Mental Ecology. Quote, a bioregion refers to geographical terrain and a terrain of consciousness, writes Peter Berg and Raymond Damasman, to a place and the ideas that have developed about how to live in that place. According to Paul Shepard, another pioneer of bioregional theory, ecological thinking, quote, requires a kind of vision across boundaries. And territory, in the sense employed by Deleuze and Guattari, refers to both physical and mental space. Drawing on Gregory Bateson's earlier work, Step to an Ecology of Mind, in his penultimate published book, The Three Ecologies, Guattari proposes three ecosophic registers: social ecology, mental ecology, and environmental ecology. Mental ecology is a cross-boundary visionary process, instantiating the interaction between social and natural ecologies. Referencing the notion of the commons and drawing on what Gary Snyder calls the old ways, in which nature and culture interpenetrated, such that there developed over time a deep identification among native peoples with the earth place they inhabited, with all the flora and fauna within that place. Ed notes that this doesn't mean we need to return to an aboriginal state of nature or lifestyle. Identification with particular regions occurs among many peoples across the planet. We simply cannot set the forces of globalization against those who would advocate a return to older ways of dwelling in a specific place. Casey also advocates mental ecology, a different awareness and mentality that confronts head-on this seemingly unbridgeable divide, at least for many, between pre- and postmodern worldviews. Bringing about shift in the mental ecological register means radically critiquing and abandoning subject-object bifurcation that subtends traditional accounts of subjectivity and epistemology. Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, subject and object give a poor approximation of thought. Thinking is neither a line drawn between subject and object, nor a revolving of one around the other. Rather, thinking takes place in the relationship between territory and earth. Re-inhabiting the earth is contingent upon rethinking our relationship to it, and bioregionalism is precisely a thinking of this in-between, or intermezzo, as they call it, wherein Casey states in The World on Edge, quote, we here move to a space in which what matters is a process of subtle becoming other. Unquote. The meaning of territorialization thus extends beyond the merely geographic. It involves an existential and valuative dimension, the formation of new values and meanings. The reality of our current social economic situation is that while most people may remain settled in a specific geographical region, the flows of commerce and immigration increasingly cross borders and boundaries, whether natural or artificial, unless they're forced to do so otherwise by some natural disaster or event of war. This is why turning toward the language of territorialization and nomadic state is important, I think. It allows for thinking bioregionalism in an expanded sense. So the question here, at least as I see it, is whether from a bioregional perspective, nomadism can be reconciled with what Ed terms, quote, the placial potential of settled dwelling. That is, the conventional understanding of bioregionalism. So what does it mean to be settled? Nomadic peoples, while always on the rise, are always on the move, are nevertheless always on the move in a particular region. The boundaries they observe are determined by the bioregion within which they dwell and inhabit. Contemporary capitalist society has increasingly moved toward a paradigm in which residing in an area or place does not mean being dependent on, or rather commingling with that place. Basic needs are increasingly satisfied through transported and imported means rather than through harvesting and, equally as important, returning an area's resources. Yes, capitalism has certainly produced a mobile culture, but not a nomadic one. Nomadism deconstructs the increasingly global capitalist market and its power to define subjectivity in its refusal to allow the market to dictate the flows of desired dwelling. A nomad, which is not the same as a migrant or an immigrant, affirms the region as essential for providing existential meaning and not merely as a means for subsisting. The concept of territorialization conjoins bioregionalism and nomadism. The typical understanding of bioregionalism as being committed to a particular place is altered by the nomadic sense of dwelling that is connected to territorialization. That is the non-positive dialectic between deterritorialization and re-territorialization. To use Ed's language, territorialization is in effect placialization. The problem that repeatedly attends the movement of territorialization is that it generally overcoats the place of its immanence with the abstract. That is, it often tends to, though not necessarily, transform smooth space into striated space, which is space that's organized, categorized, compartmentalized. Striated space is the space occupied by nation-state politics and capitalist economics, whereas bioregionalism is an attempt to subvert and replace that conception of social, political, economical organization with a model that is much more fluid. In other words, smooth. So it's important to keep in mind, in closing here, that the nomad is neither confined to a particular place nor is a point in a certain place. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish between the figures of the nomad and the migrant. The nomad traverses a territory without fixed orientation, whereas the migrant moves from one point to the next. Nomadic movement occurs within a place, the boundaries of which are fundamentally open and defined partially by the trajectory of that movement. And that's why nomadic space is territorial and regional rather than fundamentally tied to a specific place. Deleuze watch what we write, with the nomad, it's deterritorialization that constitutes the relation to the earth. To such a degree that the nomad reterritorializes on deterritorialization itself. It is the earth that deterritorializes itself in a way that provides the nomad with a territory, unquote. One can draw a parallel here between territorialization and what the Greeks understood as phusis. In fact, process is probably a more accurate word than movement for indicating the activity of territorialization and the nomad's relation to the inhabited earth. If we think of phusis as kind of a revealing, concealing process. Case takes up the term dwelling to describe this being in a place. He observes that in the smooth space of the nomad, as opposed to the mobile yet striated space of the migrant, quote, dwelling is here accomplished in traveling. One does not move to a dwelling, but rather dwells by moving. That is, by transition from place to place within, or again, as a region, unquote. Thinking not only occurs between territory and earth, but also between space and time. To think space and time is in effect to think not space-time, but rather place-time. The between of space and nature is the elemental, which is manifest through and as the natural element. Since this occurs in place, it must also occur in time. That is, as an event. Ed writes, quote, place becomes an event, a happening not only in space, but in time and history as well. To the role of place as facilitator and locator, we need to add the role of place as event-mental, as a scene of personal and historical happenings. So to really grasp the relationship between nature and space is to live bioregionally, and also to think what it means to be in a life place in time. And the time to address the host of environmental problems facing us is something that we're growing precariously short of. Thinking the nomadic as a way of entering into mental ecology, the mental ecology of bioregionalism, is contingent on rethinking what it means to be in a place, but now in a place that is guided by the sense of flow and reoriented toward the idea of the future, toward time. The effects of our dwelling are being projected, therefore, onto the future. And this changed the way we understand how we're living. Using our limited natural resources, producing food, preserving species diversity, etc. In sum, what's needed is a mental shift, so that we can begin to think of dwelling in a very different way than we do now. This is an ancient charge of philosophy. the thinking of Ed Casey stand in the vanguard of leading this charge. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention.
I'm going to make some individual remarks.
You're muted on your end.
How do we, that's probably this mic thing again, isn't it?
There we go.
Okay, can you hear us now, Brian? Good, Ed's gonna make some comments, so, yeah.
Yeah, so these are really just spontaneous comments. I did glance at some papers, others I haven't seen at all, which is all to the good. So David curses my voice. It used to be projected. A little louder. Yeah. Let's see. Does this help?
We don't have the speakers for the room. This is just for the digital recording. So I guess you project a little.
I'll try to project. Okay. Yes. But I'm especially grateful for this paper, which is very developed and very detailed. I was reading it last night until about 4:30, and I realized that to do an adequate reply would require a paper of its own. But I want to pick up just a couple of themes, and especially as it relates to my work on place and how it has evolved in ways that Brian is here specifying. My first impulse and my first effort was to really talk about place as dwelling. So if we think about this in terms of like bodily directionality, it's really where we are in and can return to and remain in a place that gives us a certain identity and continuity and historicity. And it really wasn't until I started reading Thousand Plateaus that I realized I needed to expand my model considerably outward into territory. And I would say that in my later thinking, that was a primary vector of my thinking how to take place out of its inness, as it were, its in height, into a larger spatial scenario. And territory, although abstract, and I think in many respects a term that requires a lot of deconstruction, because it just really tied in with colonialism, and one would really have to do some pretty close analysis of it to rescue a phenomenological core from it. Still does takes us out from an all too great emphasis upon staying in, staying put, staying here. Here with territory, we move out into the there, into larger regions, and that included a decisive influence from Gary Snyder, the naturalist and poet on the West Coast, who has remarkable writings on bioregionalism, which I really felt was a very important supplement to territory, which strikes me as a too abstract term in many respects, although Deleuze and Guattari attempt to concretize it in their own way. And the more I was thinking along this line of bioregionalism, the more it seemed to me I needed to say a lot more about going down. So there have been three vectors in the development of my thinking about place: in, out, and now more recently down to earth. This is my current focus on my rethinking of place. I'm always rethinking place one way or another. It appears to be, it's a lifelong obsession. It's not going to leave me, but I am at least evolving within it in these other directions. and I'm grateful to Brian for bringing out their specificity, and indeed to Deleuze and Guattari for having really led me out, as it were, from what could have been an entrapment in a predominance of domestic space, into a much more generous, open, adventuresome, nomadic in their terms, sense of placiality. And this is where I'm focusing in recent work, where I've actually linked up the notion of earth, the downward movement, with wildness and wilderness. The talk I gave on Wednesday of this last week explores this in more detail. So this I see as the placial equivalent of the unconscious in many respects, and I would like to think that this is a move that needs to be made. It is being made, of course, and it's been made not just by people like Snyder, but of course by Native Americans, from whom we're here learning that which we have repressed and never taken seriously. So this is an effort to also re-recognize the validity of Native American thinking about the primacy of land and earth beneath the subject. And I think this becomes an area that's still not fully explored. The sentence of mine was quoted by Brian. I forgot I ever wrote it, but it's interesting. Territorialization is in effect placialization. Pretty much summarizes my effort to placialize any vector or direction that one might wish to take and needs to take in the contemporary world to be environmentally and politically responsible. How to spell that out and how to really do justice to it is something I'm working on slowly but surely. And I hope that I can actually make a further contribution in this direction. There is much more I could say, but my remarks are going to be deliberately extremely short and just like a sense of how the directionality of the talk as I hear it. And I am going to have a longer prepared statement at the end of this first session that will be a little more systematic. But these are just comments that I'm making from paper to paper. And that's just the beginning. So, but I'm grateful to Brian for opening up these horizons that I have only myself glimpsed rather belatedly in my career. I shall pause with that because we need to move to another paper. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. And now, yes, Professor Ann O'Byrne of Stony Brook. Well, and maybe a little, from this place.
Matt?
Yeah.
Can you help me find the PowerPoint? That's it. I'm so happy to be here. The piece I will read is called Shared Landscape. So what does it mean to share the experience of a landscape? There was a summer evening very many years ago, and I was taking a ferry from Rochester Harbour, the southeast corner of Ireland, across the Irish Sea to Fishguard in Wales. It was a fine evening, and I remember standing on deck looking back towards the land, towards Ireland, watching the harbour and the shoreline recede as the expanse of the sunset sky extended above it and the expanse of the calm sea opened below it. The ferry was not very crowded that evening, and just a few others stood around on deck or leaned on the rail. And I fell into conversation with a young American man. I have the vaguest recollection now of what we talked about, but I know that we both looked out towards the land, looking west, for some time as the sun set, until eventually he turned to go inside. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said. Now, I wasn't overly impressed by this guy. With the cynicism of a 20-year-old and a kind of a broad stroke anti-Americanism that was de rigueur in those Reagan years, I imagined him then going downstairs busily to describe it all very earnestly in his travel journal. And I felt more than a bit indignant about what he felt entitled to think of that half hour. How come he could regard that as something that he had shared with me? Who, me? Quote unquote, Irish girl that I met on the ferry? Shared indeed. I mean, who even talked like that? What an idiot, I thought. And yet, there it was, the land and the seascape that we had both looked at. By now, the land was only a dark horizon line. I stood on the deck alone for a little while longer, looking along the shoreline that was, and still is really more deeply familiar to me than anywhere in the world. St. Helens, where I knew that there was an overgrown graveyard for drowned sailors. Carn, where we swam as children. Nethertown, where once as a small child I sat with my mother, observing the speckled granite of the boulders on the strand, and then also my father's freckled back as he walked towards the sea. And Carnsore, where my brothers had more recently joined protest against plans to build a nuclear power plant, and where there was a ruin holy to an ancient saint known as Saint Vaughn. The ferry had passed Tusker Rock Lighthouse by then, and the signal of that lighthouse was familiar from those childhood summers, and the ship's engines were chugging hard, and that diesel smell mixing with the salt air also reminded me of one particularly rough nighttime crossing when my poor sister, seasick as can be, had thrown up into a wastepaper basket. So what did this American know of all of that? What did he know at all? We'll come back to that. Few people have done more than Ed Casey has done to lead us into the experience of landscape. After reading Representing Place and Earth Mapping, World at a Glance, and indeed Up Against the Wall, we experience landscapes, paintings of landscapes, and maps indeed in a different way. This is because those books have us reflect not just on how we look at landscapes, but how we experience them, and on all that is involved in a painter, photographer, or map maker presenting a landscape to us. It is not a matter of perspective and point of view, since to educate a viewer in the manner of perspective is to lead her to the right point, the precisely right point from which to see the image properly. Instead, Ed sets aside that sort of propriety, turning our attention away from vision as such, or vision itself, whatever that might be, towards the embodied activity of seeing. This means first that the seer is also one who smells and hears and touches and tastes. Second, the seer occupies space, that is, takes up room on the face of the earth. And third, the one who sees occupies a place, orienting herself by turning this way or that, towards the mountain that rises or towards the painting hanging in the room. The seer, fourth, is someone who stands in relation to that landscape at a particular moment. She's a temporal and historical being, a unique individual. And finally, even if at this isolated moment of seeing she is quite alone, like Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer, she exists with others plurally, and the experience is never simply individual or singular or solitary. This last element of the experience of landscape is the one that most interests me. How do we share landscapes? How is our experience of landscape shareable? How do we experience landscapes together with others, singularly, plurally? And can phenomenology really help us with this? Ed's method is thoroughly phenomenological, as you know, and his descriptions and studies, in them he shows us how to approach landscape according to the practices of phenomenological study. Indeed, in the course of decades of investigation into imagination, remembering, place, body, edge, and more, he has shown us a great deal and made a decisive contribution to the phenomenological tradition. But in a way, this is already to claim too much and also too little, since it's a mistake to speak of the phenomenological tradition. After all, what would Husserl make of Ed's engagement in earth mapping with Willem de Kooning's abstract landscapes or Robert Smithson's earthworks? How would Heidegger respond to his constant return to the body? Might even Merleau-Ponty, perhaps Ed's closest interlocutor, balk at his preference for the glance over the gaze? How would any of them respond when he describes his method as peri-phenomenological, as Brian did earlier? A phenomenology of the around, a willingness to pursue the capillaries that animate the surface of things and places. A person might do phenomenology without undertaking a reckoning with the tradition and its various transcendental commitments, choosing to use the method as a way to mindfully attend to the world, experiencing an object without prejudice, allowing a thing to show itself, or allowing the subject to become conscious of its own consciousness, folding phenomenology into a contemplative, artistic, or scientific, or philosophical practice. If those who are phenomenologists in this way are pressed about the foundations of the method or the roots of their practice, they can retreat into a position protected by the as if. I am encountering the world as if. But I don't think Ed does this. I don't think he invokes the as if in this way. But what he does share with the many different sorts of practitioners of phenomenology is a resistance to dogma. This is the Ed special case, perhaps. Perhaps this is a tendency of mind that extends into many parts of life. A resistance to dogma and a willingness to let the phenomenon explode his, indeed our, expectations. This is why his study of remembering, 1987, begins quite traditionally with a few brief, even quite straightforward analyses of first-person accounts of remembering, guided by an intentionalist model of mind, and then aimed at the eidetic traits of remembering. But it finds itself almost 300 pages, and maybe almost 10 years later, in a situation that, quote unquote, edges on the entropic. What began as an orderly investigation expected to proceed along the lines already laid out in the earlier companion volume, Imagining, became something altogether more challenging. Challenging to us as readers, I think, and perhaps to you as a writer too, Ed. Now, of course, the tradition of phenomenology has a distinctive strand concerned with immanence. And this is where I think Ed would locate himself. He writes, and this is from A Life in Philosophy, the Dewey Lecture. He writes, in my view, doing phenomenology means returning to what Husserl called the sphere of immanence. But where Husserl meant by this the domain of pure consciousness, immanence, in the hands of his successors, came to mean the realm of concrete sensibility and material praxis, the life world. Transcendences of every kind, including objects and subjects, are expressions of a displaced immanence. The plane of immanence itself contains nothing reified or static. It is the realm of sheer becoming, and its ontological status is that of virtuality. If my work, if Ed's work, belongs to any single strand of phenomenology or post-phenomenology, it is this, the immanentist tendency. Close quote. We get back to the land. We get back to the land by scaling a rock face, or getting our hands into the soil of a garden, by walking the fields, or farming them perhaps, with each patch of earth and each mode of engagement yielding a distinctive experience. each one as an experience of the earth is an experience of what we all share. This is fundamental. But when we turn to the land as landscape, when we stop to take in what stretches before us, we position ourselves in relationship to it. That is to say, we get into phenomenological position. When I'm building a stone wall, and this makes me think of Wes Mattingly's dissertation, which was advised, Ed. When I'm building a stone wall, I might at no point become conscious of my consciousness of earth and stone. Caught up in the task and preoccupied by the work of my hands and body, I'm not concerned about the stone as an object of consciousness, only as an object to hold and to stack. In contrast, when I look over the land, taking in the horizon, turning this way and that, it becomes a scene as I become its beholder. It becomes landscape in my consciousness of my relation to it. And this is the intentional element of the phenomenology of landscape. There's an eidetic element too, of course, which may be present in my looking out over the land, insofar as I layer this scape over the many other views I have had of the same place or of other places, attending to the details before me as phenomenological evidence of an essence. Yet it's the landscape painter who takes on the work of discerning and representing an essence. Ed writes, quote, "The painter aims at an eidetics of the landscape, its inherent form or material essence. He describes landscape as land shape," close quote. That's from Representing Place. Note, however, that even for the painter, it is an essence of the landscape before her, not an essence of landscape proper or tout court or in itself. Just as the genii loci of the Romans were precisely not universal gods, what we reach for in the experience of landscape is the material essence of the place. Now, immanence places us in the dense earth of recalcitrant experience, but it also means we are embedded in the world of others. There's no place better than landscape to work out this complex of relations, because landscape happens precisely between earth and world. Ed writes, "Neither as deep-going or reclusive as earth, nor as ascendant or illuminated as world, neither self-secluded nor self-shown, landscape is the pivot of the two together. It is where earth and world meet. Landscape articulates and specifies the earth/world interface," close quote. The earth is what we share immanently as the ground of experience, but our experience of it becomes shareable as worldly experience, so from earth to world. There is transcendence here, but not transcendence of the world, and not transcendence that leaves behind the phenomenon as it appears to consciousness. It is transcendence of my own proprietary experience and of my relation to the world as my own particular, peculiar relation. Landscape is the privileged place for working this out, because we are earthly and worldly, and we are these things plurally. But what then about the South Wexford coast and the land and seascape that the American tourist and I shared from the deck of that ferry? The experience of landscape is shareable thanks, on the one hand, to what we share as embodied perceivers who have our origin and home on the earth, and thanks also, on the other hand, to the set of references we share as the inheritors of languages, of histories, of cultures. The former I think of as our sensus communis drawing on Kant, agreeing that it is a transcendental condition, but adding that it is also an earthly sense, putting the sensus back in sensus communis, in this earthly way. But the latter, that layering of culture, is also, I think, a sensus communis, though this time, thanks to Bob for this, drawing on Vico and the rhetorical tradition, where sensus communis is made up of the set of references, images, words, histories, shared by a speaker and his audience. This is how landscape is shareable and shared. In our experience of the land, we experience the earth that is essential to our shared being. This planet, orbiting this star, remains the source of our existence. And with a small number of temporary exceptions for space travelers, it's the persistent place of our existence. As phenomenology eventually came to appreciate, encountering a phenomenon relies on our place, embodied sensibility, making our senses the material, transcendental condition of experience. The earth, in turn, is the material, transcendental condition of embodiment. It's not that we all have the same experience of the earth, any more than we all have exactly the same senses. On the contrary, the earth is the ground for us all, jointly and severally, and the ground for our capacity of experience. As Ed reminds us then, there can be no landscape painting of the earth as a whole. That's not the point. Landscape painting gives us images of particular places, forcing us to attend to the details of this place on earth as through a microscope. Quote, "The loss of the macroscopic view is a gain in the discriminating look." So too with choreographic landscape painting. We lose the region as a geographic entity, but we grasp its material essence in terms of the discrete localities that are its integral parts. Close quote. What I've emphasized here then is that each of us will share the painter's view in a way that will be like and unlike the way that all other beholders share it. It will be like the others because the artist and we are beholders, and because the artist as artist and we as beholders assume a shared embodied earthly sensibility. This is the basis of the enabling assumption that we can communicate our experience, if not universally, then at least to our fellow earthlings. This is earthly transcendental sensus communis. My mode of sharing will be unlike the others because nobody's life experience has matched mine. Yet I've accumulated experience in a culture, with a cohort, as part of a community, as belonging to a generation in various places. I share distinct sensus communis with the members of these groups and with those who inhabit my small worlds within the wider world. So, on the deck of that Fishguard ferry, I knew, of course, what the American was saying. We did share a language, after all, and certainly very many assumptions about the world. Had I been less grumpy, maybe, I might have discovered more about him and the place he experienced as his home place. Had I been more generous, I might have shared more, letting him in on some details about the Rath, the fairy fort at Ballytrent, or the Holy Well at Ladies Island. Ed writes, "Radical reflection is an entire practice of thrusting oneself or allowing oneself to be thrust into the plane of immanence, going down under transcendental conditions of possibility, as well as categories and forms, down to the level of experience that is operative at all times and places, however differently expressed culturally and linguistically." Close quote. Now, if I were to pick out an image for this thought, I think it must be a photographic seascape by Hiroshi Sugimoto. If I were to, the image is gray, luminous at the top, and darkening down towards the bottom. The light-colored portions of the top seem blank and without any texture at all, but once the color begins to darken in the middle of the frame, it appears that this fog has given way to the patterns of water, a textured gray, which is the rippled texture of the calm sea. And light seems to emanate from within the fog, suggesting a horizon that remains unseen. 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in ocean. And this could be anywhere in the broad temperate latitudes where sea fog happens. It's hard to imagine a landscape that could be so impossible to identify on the basis of the image alone. The sea, more readily than the land, delivers us to the sense of something operative at times and places. Yet the title of the photograph specifies one of the Earth's seas, the one just south of where that ferry was crossing on that night, on Celtic Sea near Bocastle, which is in Cornwall. It specifies this small town on the north coast of Cornwall and a year, 1994. Abruptly then, given this language, given this title, the sea is a place. It draws us these images, and Sugimoto has very many, almost indistinguishable from this one. In each case, it's only the title of the place, the title that gives us a place and a year. But in each case, what we see is an image that draws us in with this light and sea and darkness and an intimation somewhere in there of horizon. If there is a Claude-style repoussoir at work here, working to draw our eye into the picture, it is the horizon that we are sure must be there, but that evades our look and retreats into the light. Each of these scapes, so unplaceable and so specifically placed, is charged with an inchoate emotion. Now concluding, had I known about this way of thinking, had I known then about Ed's radical reflection and about Sugimoto's vision of the sea, we might have crossed from starboard to port, the American and I, and instead of looking back to the land, would have looked out to the north and to the east, over the sea, at a view that would remain a view of air and water and nothing more for a couple of hours until the lights of Wales came into sight. We might have shared there an experience of place neither of us could name or quite place. Instead of the line of land to mark the distinction between sea and sky, we would have looked at the gradations of blue and grey that met at horizon that would have become gradually harder to discern. It was a calm crossing after all, so there would have been few white horses and not much wind, just the sea air, the sense of the depths below us, the sky overhead, and that meridian of the earth turning towards darkness. Thank you.
Wow, eloquence, powerful. It's, and put some finger on something that's always puzzled me, which is the one thing I want to paint and only want to paint. Nothing else is landscape. And this really helps me to understand that landscape has about an ontological and phenomenological force. I've written about it, you know, and I know some things about it, but the way that Anne is approaching it here really helps me to understand that it is not merely unique in human experience, but uniquely powerful in drawing us out of the personalized orbit of our all too cloistered beliefs and limited lives. Not so much into the impersonal, but into, I guess it's a form of transpersonal that it moves us toward. It's a curious convergence here because, as Tony knows better than any of us, for Husserl, horizon was an absolutely key term, and not merely another incident or feature of painting, but or of photography or of perception. But there's something very uncanny about horizon. It's neither an object, nor is it a mere idea. It is to be seen, it is perceived, it is immanent in our experience. And it's almost always there, except in these remarkable photographs. It may disappear for the moment, but of course, that's the point. We have an urdox there. We know that it's there, and we never doubt it. It's not just a limit on the perceptual field, but it is what I now call an edge, which means something which leads us other than what it itself may seem to be structurally, identically, straightforwardly. And this is the powerful sense that my vision, and indeed if I'm out hiking in the land, even on bodily, I want and wish and can move beyond it. It invites me to that other side very, very powerfully. So I do, Anne's put her finger on something which, you know, in my own listing of things I've written about, I wouldn't have thematized it so much, but in fact, I think she's really singled out something that clarifies my own preoccupation with landscape. We actually have a painting here of mine, which I didn't put it there, I don't know who did, but anyway, Anne did.
Exhibit A.
Yeah, Exhibit A. So notice here, horizon is, you know, shown by trees and then a kind of blank extension, as if to say it's enigmatic, you know, cannot be represented as such. Although I wasn't thinking those thoughts when I was just painting, you know, and trying to make something. This is a Maine coast, I'm pretty sure it must have been. But I think that's why it's so inspiring to me, because you never exhaust the many ways that you can paint, represent, right, horizon. There just is, there's no limitation. It's quite extraordinary in that respect. Whereas if I focused on a rock in here, I could probably exhaust it in 7 or 8 paintings. I would like to believe I could exhaust its actual structure, but you can't do that with horizon. So horizon is really an extraordinary penumbral, I now call it periphenomenal presence, right? So it's not like robust phenomena where we're right under hand and underfoot, but these are phenomena which, by their very nature, withdraw as we approach them. The peri means around, about, not in our immediate field of vision, but as it were, circling and surrounding it. There would be a lot more to say, Anne, but there's a beautiful paper and poetic as well as philosophical.
I think if any bits of it were poetic, they were the bits I was quoting you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pretty tough act to follow. So, I have a title for my talk. It's called Time and Autonomy, the Impossible Generosity of Edward S. Casey. So like everyone here, I am truly honored to be able to participate in the celebration of Edward S. Casey's career. Clearly, his philosophical thinking influenced all of us. But perhaps more importantly, his style of living influenced all of our lives, our very manner of being. And with style, little joke here, I do not mean as unmistakable manner of speaking. Of course, many of us, maybe all of us at some moment, imitate the way he speaks. At least for me, my imitations are more unconscious. I would say something, and then a moment later I think to myself, geez, I sound just like Ed. No, I do not mean his manner of speaking. With his style of life, I mean the generosity he showed towards all of us. Throughout my career, unfortunately with limited success, I try to imitate Ed's extraordinary generosity. So here, let me express my gratitude for the limited, indeed impossible generosity he showed me over the last 40 years. So thank you, Ed. Now, in order to prepare for this session, I went back to Ed's earliest works, Imagining, which first appeared in 1976, and Remembering in 1987. Reading these books again took me back to my first days at Stony Brook. I would call this kind of memory reminiscing, perhaps a wistful memory. In Remembering, Ed describes wistful reminiscence as this is a quote from Ed, as a bittersweet activity in which sadness is mixed with pleasure. So, with a mixture of sadness and joy, I remember that when I entered the program in 1978, the halls and classes were filled with the talk of phenomenology. The approaches to phenomenology varied across the professors. In my first semester, I was enrolled in Don Welton's seminar on logical investigations. In the seminar, which I was filled with admiration for, Don engaged in a careful reading of the text, sometimes going down to a sentence-by-sentence analysis. Then I had a seminar with Don Ivey on doing phenomenology. Where, if you remember Don's seminars, he never engaged in textual analysis, very different from Don Welton. But with Don, I learned a lot because he practiced imaginative variations. Then there were Ed's seminars, which not only showed us how to do phenomenology, not only how to read phenomenological texts, but also how to think phenomenologically. Ed taught us how to pursue what he now calls the peri-phenomenological, which he's mentioned many times. He taught us how to pursue all the aspects at the limits of the phenomenon, all its imaginable variations, and all the implications of these possible variations. So I think back, I remember myself being thrilled at each of these seminars in phenomenology. However, at odds with the phenomenological murmur in the halls of old physics in 1978, that was the original name of the building in 78, there was also the murmur of Derrida. For me, as you know, the deconstructed murmur resounded more loudly in my ears. To use Ed's words, I immersed myself in les nouvelles vagues, right? Their being bound to text and the irony of their temper attracted me more than the structure of things. And here I'm quoting Ed's preface to second edition of Imagining. So indeed, at that time, deconstruction was presented as hostile to phenomenology, as a kind of anti-phenomenology. It was only when I was older, more mature, I have other professors I studied with here, many of you remember as being quite immature, so only when I was more mature, right, I came to realize that deconstruction is the very elaboration of phenomenology. Nothing happens in deconstruction without the fundamental phenomenological insight into the experience of the other. Of course, Ed's teaching and thought straddled both sides, or perhaps we should say this thinking was on the edge of phenomenology and deconstruction. Evidence of this edgy location is the fact that Ed made the first English translation of Derrida's Usia and Grame in 1970. And citing Derrida's of Gravitology and Imagining, Ed valorizes imagining and philosophy over Derrida's word, philosophy's logocentrism. More importantly for me, since I'll return to this point in a moment, Ed refers in the conclusion to remembering to Derrida's idea of restance. For Ed, remembering, as we shall see, always involves a remainder. I'm going to go get my water. So as I said, in order to prepare for this session, I returned to Ed's first two books, Imagining and Remembering. As I read parts of both. Two questions, perhaps related, came over me. First, in rereading Remembering, I realized that Ed had pursued the question of memory without an examination of time. Indeed, one finds out in Remembering that memory, this is what Ed talking, involves something more than the purely temporal in its own makeup. The something more is that memory has not just a point of view, but a place in which we are situated. Okay, that's Ed talking. So, remembering is kind of like getting it back in place. Already in 1987. My realization that time was omitted was reinforced when I looked at the title of Ed's books. If one looks at the titles chronologically, one cannot fail to see a movement away from the faculties of imagination and memory to what has no faculties, to what is outside the mind, a movement towards space, place, the environment, the earth. Why the constant push towards space? Why did Ed end up writing no book on time? The omission of such a book is particularly striking. One would think that Heidegger did not entitle his book Being in Space, but Being in Time. It is perhaps no exaggeration to say, appropriating an idea from Deleuze, that the plane of immanence for 20th century philosophy, or at least continental philosophy, has been defined by the question of time. It seems that in the 20th century, how one thinks about philosophy is based on how one thinks about time. So the first question I'm asking then is, why place and not moment? Second question came to me when I reread the conclusions to both imagining and remembering. I'd forgotten that both conclusions concern autonomy. Again, a quick survey of the titles of Ed's books reveals that he wrote no book on autonomy or freedom, even though autonomy plays such a big role in imagining and remembering. Second question that came to me then is, why did Ed never write a book on autonomy? Combining the two questions, I'm asking why he never wrote a book on both time and autonomy. And that's where the title of my talk comes from, my short talk. Yet perhaps we find the beginnings of a book on time and autonomy in the World on Edge. Since I closely studied Ed's World on Edge for a SPEP book panel, and if I'm remembering correctly, both Ed and David Carr were the founding meetings, SPEP, is that right? Yeah, founding members. Right. So I was reading Ed's book, World on Edge for a SPEP book panel. I noticed something that none of the published reviews of the book, at least the ones I could find at that moment, found something that they did not see. I noticed in the afterword forward to the book, Ed discusses choice. I highlighted his idea of choice in my commentary on the World on Edge. In the World on Edge, choice means, as Ed says, staying on the edge. Now, despite the image of the edge suggesting sharpness and narrowness, I think this conception of choice means that genuine choice is always thick. It is a thick choice because one does not simply slice the choice into a neither nor, into a one or the other. Instead, the thickness resides in the fact that the choice is a both and. This thickness defines the very conception of autonomy we find in remembering. This conception also implies something about time. Now, Ed conceived remembering as a kind of sequel to imagining, but the conceptions of autonomy in each book's conclusions are strikingly different. Imagining thematizes imagining's independence from all sorts of things, independence from perception, causal relationships, and context. In its essence, it is removed from the world. Imagining is the freedom of the mind. As the freedom of the mind, this autonomy is what Ed calls a thin autonomy. Ed defines thin autonomy as an autonomous mode of functioning that is essentially disconnected from the robust world of practice. So conversely, in its stark opposition, thick autonomy, it seems, must be a mode of functioning that is essentially connected to, engaged with, the robust world of praxis. However, we find the exact definition of thick autonomy only in the Remembering book. As it says there in the conclusion, and the somewhat long quote from it, but not very long, that thick, as it applies to matters of memory, means centrally that memory possesses a depth not easily penetratable by the direct light of consciousness, resistant to conceptual understanding, sediment in layers, and having historical depth. And perhaps here, with the thickness of sedimentation and historical depth, we find the seed of a book on time. The seed seems to be that the thickness of memory implies an unconsciousness of the past and unpredictability of the future. In particular, historical depth implies that memories have a perdurance. Perdurance leads us to autonomy. For Ed, memory's perdurance implies that memory exists in relation to the factor of the unresolved remainder. It is here that Ed refers to Derrida's idea of restance, which, despite its active suffix "ance," as in différance, right, is usually rendered in English as remainder. In any case, as Ed says, the unresolved remainders are remembering's original habitat. Remembering dwells like a native in the realm of remainders. Now, the unresolved remainders come into view when we remember the ones we care about. We remember what we left unsaid to them, what we left undone for them. But so far, I've said nothing about the autonomy of memory. The autonomy of remembering consists not only in being enveloped, says word, in the thick remainder, but also in developing the remainder into the flow of speech and deeds. The autonomy of memory therefore consists in the work, again Ed's word, to resolve the remainder. It consists in the attempt to say what was left unsaid and to do what was left undone. So my final paragraph. So I began with the unlimited generosity Ed showed towards me and towards all of us. I'm sure my success in academic philosophy would not have happened without Ed's efforts on my behalf. And when we get to the testimonial, I can give you a specific example of this if you're interested, how he worked on my behalf. As I said earlier, I owed Ed a debt of gratitude. I hope my words today make some small contribution towards the resolution of this remainder. More importantly, I hope that my work for my students, which now extends over several decades, has developed in some way the enveloped generosity I received from Ed. But as I confessed at the beginning, my own attempts to emulate Ed's generosity have had limited success. I don't really want to talk about that, actually. Maybe some of you heard about my lack of success in being generous, so not to be too autobiographical, something I'm not so proud of, but anyways, so consequently, for many reasons, I don't rest in good conscience. Even though, as Derrida says, repeatedly near the end of his career, resolving the remainder is the impossible itself. You can see how this idea might think, well, if it's impossible, I can't, nothing I can do about it, right? But Derrida always turns this, right? And he says, actually, that means you can never rest in good conscience. You must always strive to resolve the remainder. So, instead of resting in good conscience, I, maybe me in particular, but we must find every way to achieve the impossible. More specifically, we must find every way to make ourselves equal to the impossible generosity it showed and still shows towards us. So I have one more comment to make. It is customary to conclude a talk with a thank you, But in this case, due to the impossible, my thank you remains forever insufficient.
Well, thank you, Len. That's really very moving and very insightful. I'll just comment on these two factors that are the primary, the twin topics of your speech, time and autonomy. So my not writing on time was a very conscious decision, in part because I felt that too much had been already said about time. Time was an obsessive concern from Husserl through Heidegger on through Merleau-Ponty, although Merleau-Ponty is not as abject in that respect. Nevertheless, it seemed to me that plenty of work had been done, and I was not interested in entering into some contest or some competition with thinkers of that order. And also, it was part of my larger reading of the history of philosophy that time had been privileged over, not to space, but of course what I came to call place. And that led to the writing of my longest book, The Fatal Place. And Fatal Place really is pretty much vis-a-vis the ascendance and supremacy, supposedly, of time. Personal time, collective time, institutional time, you name it. So I really set out to work in another direction, quite consciously. And then I had an autobiographical detail. A friend from now, in recent times at Vanderbilt, David Wood, was writing up a storm on time. And we once met at SPEP, and we actually shook hands, and we agreed. I said, all right, David, you take care of time. I'm going to take care of space. Well, it was a joke, but nevertheless, it was something serious in it that I didn't really want to compete when it came to matters of time. So there was some reason behind what Len correctly picks out as a relative neglect of the temporal dimension, even in a book on memory, which is, striking, I admit, but nevertheless concerted. On autonomy, yes, once I worked through the notion of thin and thick autonomy in those early books, I really felt I had to give that up. I was increasingly disenchanted with the whole notion of some kind of deep ontological freedom. I was more and more suspicious of this as a form of modern subjectivism, contributing to the subject powers that really don't belong to that subject, and freedom, freedom of choice above all, but all kinds of freedom belong to that view of the inflated, what I regard as inflated subjectivity, inflated view of subjectivity. So that was pretty conscious. I mean, Len's right. I didn't return to it, but I was conscious and concerted. I didn't really think, I thought enough had been said about autonomy by Kant, by even Sartre, and I was much closer to Derrida, who, was deeply skeptical also of anything like autonomy. So the restance, which Len mentions, is a good example of a kind of deep-seated resistance in human existence, in human life, right? That cannot be dissolved and overcome by anything like a so-called primary freedom. It's a myth, it's a wish. It's even understandable that we might want to posit that. And particularly from the standpoint of liberationist thought, perfectly admirable when it comes to the political domain. But I thought as a phenomenologist, I can't really posit this as a generic trait of human beings. It's really quite the opposite. And so my work on place was an effort to speak about the rootedness of human experience and something over which you do not exert ever complete control. Partial control, yes, you can improve conditions and you can get better at doing certain things in place, but you're really not free to remake it entirely. So this would be called traditionally a given, but a datum. But it seemed to me that it was larger. The story was larger than that, and that's really what led me to my obsession with place as the pre-given, presumed, a priori basis of human experience, much more so than time, and much more so than the autonomy of the human subject. So those are my brief comments on the spot. Hearing your wonderful paper, Len, thank you. So, right.
Last but not least, Tony Steinbeck, newly of this place, Stony Brook University.
Oldly and newly.
Oldly and newly.
Can we leave the door open, maybe, just so we have a little circulation there, if you don't mind? Thanks. Thank you. I'm going to say a few words about Ed's Perry phenomenology. It's a term he uses to evoke a special attentiveness to subtle, elusive phenomena, those he claims that are unjustly but systematically neglected by philosophers and even some phenomenologists, whereby their supposed peripheral status is mistakenly posited as insignificant. Not the head-on, full-bodied presence that usually gets our attention. These Perry phenomena are nearly nothing, he says, at least according to some habits of mind. But these Perry phenomena, such as glances and edges, just to name the titles of two of his recent books, have their peculiar fugitive presence that is no less eventful, intense, and dynamic. If glances, like edges, are Perry phenomena, if indeed they have their own force and influence, as he suggests, and if indeed they too have a unique presence, all their own, then they are susceptible to unique phenomenological description. Casey appreciates that there are certain presences, like glances and edges, that are persistent and formative in our lives, and this is despite the fact that virtually every epistemology and ontology in Western systems of thought have pushed them to the side, relegating them to the periphery. Casey picks them up where they have been left off, on the marges, on the fringes, and therefore calls them periphenomena. His attempt to restore to periphenomena the concerted attention they deserve leads him to show their variety and their import for the constitution of the world in which we live. He wants to do this by bringing to fuller consciousness the dense inherence of periphenomena, like glances and edges, back into our individual and collective lives, and by awakening this consciousness of them by bringing them to a more complete attention, so that we can live with a broader and deeper thoughtfulness with regard to them. The implication here is that if phenomenology is the blanket term for a discipline of describing things that have been recognized since the Greek origins of Western thought, then there should be a different kind of phenomenology that is attentive to what has been sidelined, a phenomenology of the glancing blow, or of the glancing edge, what Casey has hinted at as a periphenomenology. Now, the status of a periphenomenology is curious for Casey, and perhaps ambiguous and fleeting as it should be. In the preface to The World at a Glance, he mentions that this method of proceeding can be called, this is early on, a paraphenomenological one, because it exists alongside, literally at the limits of traditional phenomenology. That was a quote. By the end of the chapter 2 of this work, this expression is replaced by a periphenomenology. And he writes, and I quote, "To describe the glance as a mediatrix of disparate surfaces is an exercise of periphenomenology, a phenomenology of the around, a willingness to pursue the capillaries that animate the surfaces of things, places, and persons," close quote. By the time we reach his concluding thoughts of this work, we see Casey introducing those special phenomena termed periphenomena, but this time in relationship to the gaze and the glance. Periphenomena elude direct grasp or stable seeing, in short, the gaze. But precisely as such, they are rightful contents of the glance and its non-visual equivalents. It's the glance, this attentiveness that sweeps the fringes, which picks up the periphenomena. And Casey writes, "With ciliated attentiveness, the seen subject casts a glance, and thereby gets a sense of what the world of vision is like. This sense is finally the sense that is made of the primal domain of visual perception by drawing this all too solid phenomenal realm into something periphenomenal, but edged. Ephemeral, yet effective, apperceptive, as well as perceptive. This happens," he says, "in the gentle blow of the interanimating action, an action accomplished in the single stroke that displays the world at a glance." Close quote. Casey informs the reader that what he has called his way of proceeding in World on Edge a periphenomenology because, insofar as it's a descriptive enterprise, teasing out major and minor edges of human experience, it is phenomenological and continuous with previous efforts of doing phenomenological description. He explains that the peri aspect of periphenomenology not only shares an affinity with edges, but captures outstanding and instanding phases and parts of things and events, as these phases and parts embody the defining shapes of all that we experience. Whether by the name periphenomenology or another, we can ask after the role of the phenomenological attitude. Our first clues to its meaning are glances and edges. Phenomenology makes a critical distinction, and by the way, it's always already critical, a critical distinction between what we can call the natural attitude, in which the sense of things and their emergent meanings are taken for granted, preposited, accepted in advance without any way of acknowledging this acceptance, and another attitude in which these senses and meanings, these phenomena, come to the fore as such and whose emergence and acceptance is not taken for granted. Indeed, the so-called natural or mundane attitude only comes to the fore as such through this phenomenological attentive attitude. Accordingly, it's not the case that edges and glances are not given in experience. They are, but they are given, and here they are similar to other phenomena, in a naive acceptance, without noticing their appearing or givenness and their giving dimensions in experience. The problem is that edges, like glances, are so peripheral, where certain habits of thoughts are concerned, that they have tended to escape even a critical phenomenological attentiveness to the phenomena. But now that we have become more attuned to them through Casey's work, we can ask how, for example, edges are given in the natural attitude. Casey points to the glance. It is indeed the glance that takes in the edges that are at the very basis of the contours and profiles that the glance naturally seeks out. It is not just that the glance and edges are parallel periphenomena, but the giving of edges takes place through the glance. There's no coincidence that those two works are the glance and the edge, I don't think. Edges are periphenomena. As periphenomena are the rightful contents of the glance. Casey writes in World at a Glance, glances flit over surfaces touching edges, he continues on World on Edge. Glances, too, are periphenomena, and even though they track the fleeting edges, they too are fleeting, elusive, marginal, which makes them in part too periphenomena. To use traditional phenomenological language, there's an intentional relation, in quotes, between glances and edges, like a perceiving perceived, a glancing glanced relation, given of course that the glance takes in more than edges, and given that the phenomenological notion of intentionality can encompass more than a noesis noematic correlation. Edges draw our glance, but disappear from every look. For the gaze naturally does not remain long on them. And because they are elusive, they flay, solicit, and undo our glances. It is glancing, to use Casey's expression, as the peculiar giving quality in which edges are detected, that pick up the around. They pick up the peri. This occurs already within the natural attitude. So we have to ask, is there an attitude that can deliver the glance as glancing, as it caresses edges? To broach this question, I propose distinguishing between, first of all, what we can call a paradoxical attitude, in which we take for granted periphenomena like edges and glances themselves. We are surrounded by them, deal with them, we use them, are invested in them, presuppose them, and implicitly and explicitly posit them. So, on the one hand, we can call a paradoxical attitude, and then a periphenomenological attitude in which the edges and glances are brought critically to the fore. But a periphenomenology, a phenomenology of glancing edges, as it were, would itself be a distinctive glancing within the experience itself. So while it's true that for the most part the glance escapes its own detection, and for the most part the glance will not yield its secrets to its own action, quote Ed, because naturally it flees even itself. Casey's work suggests a kind of phenomenological glancing. This glancing, which possesses a discernment of its own, would be more than a mere reflection on the glance, since it itself glancingly glances at and is attentive to what is going on as it's going on in order to pick up the periphenomena, even glancing as a periphenomenon. I think this is what's in fact going on in such a phenomenological attitude. But it is Casey who has brought it to the fore through his glancing attentiveness to the glance. Let's call this a radical glancing, like Merleau-Ponty's or Husserl's radical reflection. These are glancings where the not yet apprehended comes to light in a critical manner, perhaps belonging to the type of what Casey has identified as a mental glancing. As Casey puts it, only a periphenomenology, alert to these peripheries, is able to detect and describe them adequately. Here I would propose that we have something like a phenomenological glancing, or radical glancing, that glances at the experience within the experience, and glancing away or deflecting, allowing then for a concerted reflection. In fact, I think several glancings are going on in a radical glancing. I think we have a glancing back to an experience, a glancing at what is going on now, and a glancing into experiencing itself, and a glancing away from what is being experienced so as to deflect it, and a glancing through the experience to get to its modalizations and variations. It would be a discovering and reorienting glance. Radical glancing gives us the whole in its constitutive accomplishments, and because glancing in and of itself glances at, without initially objectifying that which is given in the glancing at, it can deliver periphenomena, like the glance. And itself having a peculiar structure without reducing it to an object reflected upon and thereby losing it completely as glance. What we owe to glancing then is a direct attentiveness to experience as it's ongoing, bringing it to the fore as living in the experience itself. With the glance, we catch ourselves as it escapes us. Part of any phenomenological effort is the experience of the experiencing as it's ongoing, or again, to single out within the experience itself, the experiencing as it's ongoing. But because of our finitude, radical glancing only catches wisps of the experience. When we seize upon it too boldly, it eludes us and gives way to the object of reflection. At this point, radical glancing needs to be re-executed. And just as an allusion to Derrida, maybe this is what he means by the philosophy falling into crisis constantly as the source point of its own origin. A phenomenology of glancing edges, therefore, is a radical attentiveness, a glancing, deflecting, reflecting, glancing within the experience itself. It is an informed glance in an ever-augmenting periphenomenal world that is not only free itself, but frees up the periphenomena. Still, a periphenomenology does not just discern and describe the constitutive dimensions of experience. In addition, it works within and from givenness to make structural distinctions. So any phenomenology is not just describing the way something is given or appears, but the structural distinctions in that experience. In this regard, Casey has expressed it in The World on Edge, that a periphenomenology is designed to attend to the internal and external edge structures in a detailed and dedicated way, close quote. That is, periphenomenology does what we can call phenomenological edge work, or a critical edging. Periphenomenology distinguishes within the given this from that, discerning a priori structures of all kinds. It edges. The phenomena then, being delivered over in their fullness, with the initial glancing, experiencing, are open to internal discriminations. Radical glancing takes it all in, and critical edging articulates the dynamics of the phenomenal appearing. But we can still be more precise. First, critical edging is not a mere repetition of what is putatively already there, because that would presuppose their very being in describing it. It does not simply reflect already defined, pre-existing determinations of being, because sometimes the way the phenomena give themselves suggests their very a priori or so-called ontological status. That is, critical edging, as making distinctions, is creative, precisely in its discernment of the structures it brings to expression. Second, critical edging is not arbitrary because the discriminations and discernments that phenomenological edgework carries out occur within a whole, given through glancing. Critical edging makes or edges internal discriminations, whereby phenomena given in radical glancing are distinguishing themselves from one another. Finally, critical edging, which makes phenomenological distinctions, does not limit off one structure from another. The distinctions emergent from phenomenological edgework are not separations, since the edge is a factor in discriminations, and the self-discrimination of the phenomena are, as Casey suggests, already relational. Every critical edging that makes an edge distinction is double-edged. It's interrelational. Thus, the aspects of phenomenological edgework, or what we can call this critical edging, would be threefold where the discernment of structures is concerned. There's creative elaboration, there's internal discriminating, and there's relating as interrelating. So to conclude these thoughts, periphenomenology can be understood as a radical glancing and critical edging. Now, if this is the case, and it seems to be so, one can now inquire into the distinctive status of a periphenomenology. Is periphenomenology a special kind of attunement to so-called periphenomena? That is it a special kind of phenomenology that operates alongside of or even within phenomenology, such that it has a style of its own? Or is periphenomenology not just what good phenomenology is and has been or should be doing all along? The response is neither so simplistic nor so reductive as these formulations may suggest. To take a stand on this, however, I want to take one further clue from Ed, this time when he reflects on glances and edges. He writes, in each instance, his work on glances and work on edges, what is at first tempting to consider extrinsic or secondary ends by being intrinsic and primary to the experiences in which they figure. With respect then, that was a quote, with respect to the phenomenological enterprise, Ed's work may have started out historically as a mode of phenomenology or as an around or an alongside phenomenology, but in its very practice, it has revealed itself to be, in new ways, I think, the core and practice of phenomenology itself. In short, in what I would call its optimality, periphenomenology as radical glancing and critical edging become exemplary of the very phenomenological effort itself. So I will conclude by saying that thanks to Ed's concerted and sometimes daring academic and interpersonal radical glancing and critical edging, Ed has creatively brought to expression the very meaning of the phenomenological enterprise, and thereby, among other things, of course, has made a truly lasting and dynamically essential contribution to what phenomenology means to be.
Well, one curious fact about my work on the glance is it really began in a very limited objective. I thought that Foucault and Birth of the Clinic overemphasized the importance of the medical gaze. That was kind of the single most precipitating origin. I thought, well, wait a minute, you know, yes, of course, surgeons do need to gaze intently, and I'm not objecting to that in surgery, but he generalized in that book to a primacy of gaze in many other ways of life. And that just struck me as false. I think gazing does have a place, and it's usually a very specific place, has to do with finding detail, of which surgery would be a perfect example. But my interest in phenomenology has always been, what do we do for the most part spontaneously, and not in terms of the override of professionalization that a given occupation might bring with it. So I embarked on this journey. It took me 10 years. It's the longest book I ever wrote, 680 pages on that mere glance. I mean, if you think about it, there's something quite absurd about this. And the book has actually sold very few copies, because people are like intimidated. Do I want 700 pages on this trivial topic? And still, it's there. It's still in print, but it's going to be in print probably for several lifetimes. But I must say that Tony has made much more phenomenological and methodological sense of the importance of the glance than I think I ever did myself. Really relating it to classical phenomenological procedures and reflection. So I'm very grateful to Tony for having added this crucial dimension that I barely touch on in the book. It was, I was just trying to say, glancing is all over the place. It's far more important than we give it credit for. It's not a secondary or trivial act. A mere glance, we have that phrase in English. Well, it's, actually often the case that a mere glance turns up something of very special importance. You know that in interpersonal relations. A mere glance can show what the other person's really thinking and wanting to do in a way that a studied look probably would not, because that gives the other person the time to be on the defensive. So the more I got into it, the more I found it fascinating, partly because it had been so neglected by philosophers and indeed even perceptual psychologists. And I thought, and that was part of my reason. And in general, I generally do like to write about things that have been systematically neglected by philosophers and others. That would include place in many respects. But the glance is a particularly striking case of this. And the work on Edge, which followed, almost as long, was, as Tony very, very beautifully shows, closely related. I wasn't really saying that we glance only at edges, but that edges are themselves, in their being asides, you could call it. This is like asideness, right? Besideness. Are, as it were, prime candidates for being glanced at. But some of them are more compelling, lasting, and I would not want to ignore that. And I do try in this book on the Edge to go into these to some extent. And I have a general statement on Edge, which we'll see how our time goes. I may try to read a little bit later. That was just for this occasion, and particularly for this first symposium. But I think I won't actually, you all have been very attentive, and we've had a wonderful beginning. I think I won't bog it down with that, not quite yet, anyway. And so this is really, I think, part of my, the later work that I did. My early work was taking up, well-known, well-researched topics, imagination, memory. I mean, there's just vast literatures, of course, on both of these. And I don't know, I guess being young and foolish, I thought, well, I might as well dive into that literature, and make something different of it. But in the later years, I really felt, no, I'm going to actually take up topics that are really neglected as such, and need to be thematized philosophically and phenomenologically. And it was along the way that I came across the notion of a new methodology, peri-phenomenology. It's not really a rigorous method or anything like that. It's it's really just means paying attention to that which we tend to regard as merely secondary, derivative, or sidereal, right? Peripheral. And that just seemed to me to be crying out to be explored and presented as a way of proceeding in philosophy that needed to be valorized. I mean, great authors are doing it all the time anyway, but they haven't really, as it were, consolidated it as a method. And mine is not a method either, in the sense of not a certain number of steps. It isn't that way. It's more of an attitude, you can say, a receptive attitude. That it's all about, I would say. Yes. Yeah, I think even now in my newer work, I hope to pursue really neglected, overseen things that have not been adequately considered. And one of these topics is something which I had wanted to write a book about many, many years ago, as on thinking. Now I'll have time to think about thinking in a much more concerted way, and Megan Craig and I are writing a book together on thinking in transit, thinking in transitory, transitional circumstances, as opposed to the classical view of thinking as a scholar, at a desk and a cubicle and so forth. How to capture spontaneous thought itself in the act is going to be an aim of this book that we are just beginning to undertake. Yeah, so that's another direction that I find myself going in for reasons I don't really fully understand. I really want to write no more single authored books. I've had it. I really only want to write with someone else and co-author. That's a powerful motive, and Fred Evans and I are planning a book together. We hope we shall put together in the near future. Mary Watkins, who's here today, that was my first co-authored book, On the Border, Up Against the Wall. And that went well, but I thought, well, I tried that, and that seemed to go fine. I don't need to do it again. But now it's coming back in a very powerful way. I think I'm suspicious of books that are just the work of one thinker, one author. So I'm much more into the spirit of cooperative thinking together in writing a book. I have just finished a book with Michael Martin, co-authored, on plants, and called Plants in Place. How the placement of plants is very, very different from that of animals and other beings on Earth. We both tried to capture what was very special about the placiality of plant life. So it's, in that sense, I guess you'd say that all of my later work is about topics that appear to be at first very limited in scope: glance, edge, plant, place. But nevertheless, I find that a very productive way of proceeding, as opposed to taking on the classical, as it were, overarching imperial topics. I tried that. I went that road. I don't need to do it again. So those are just a few remarks, and thank you, Tony, for a great favor. And indeed, I want to thank the whole first panel in providing four very provocative, thoughtful papers. There will be more to be said, but I think for now we should take a break, and where's coffee, and where is it located? Melissa? I don't know.
It's here.